I'm Steve Hindy, Chairman of Transportation Alternatives. One of the great accomplishments of Mayor de Blasio is the appointment of Polly Trottenberg to lead the Department of Transportation. Polly had a provident beginning. She was endorsed by her predecessor, Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, and by Jeanette's predecessor, Iris Weinshall, at a time when there was very little else that those two commissioners could agree upon. During Polly's tenure, New York City has led the nation with initiatives like the 14th Street busway, congestion pricing, streets master plan, commercial waste zone reform, and the dangerous driver abatement program. In the era of COVID, DOT lost staff to the pandemic, but Polly and her team led one of the nation's most ambitious street repurposing efforts, creating 80 miles of open streets, supporting thousands of restaurants through the Open Restaurants Plan, and creating hundreds of miles of dedicated bike and bus lanes. New York City is a world leader of Vision Zero, thanks to Polly and her team. And DOT is one of the coolest places to work in New York City. Both Jeanette and Polly often complained that TA never gave them or their mayors, Bloomberg or de Blasio, the credit they deserved for their accomplishments. And that's probably true because TA is an advocacy organization, and we will never be happy until Vision Zero is a reality. Even then, we'll probably find something to complain about. In spite of those differences, Polly has always listened to TA and Families for Safe Streets, and I don't think there is any doubt about her commitment to safe streets and to a more livable city. I'm sure I speak for everyone at TA and Families for Safe Streets when I say thank you to Polly and her team for the work you do. And a special thanks for delivering our Vision Zero Cities Conference keynote today. Thank you, Polly.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And you are absolutely right. I've always said about you, yes, there are days when we don't agree, and you guys can often be harsh critics, but you're also the wind in our sails. You have helped us accomplish so many amazing things, both in the city and up in Albany. We couldn't do any of it without you, all the accomplishments you've mentioned. We certainly share some of the credit. So I'm now going to attempt to put up a presentation that I will run through quickly because I'm very excited. I know we have a fantastic audience here. I know you all have had a great discussion today, not only about Vision Zero, but all the topics that are on our minds today, how we transform streets after COVID, what are sort of our latest thoughts on criminal justice and policing and enforcement of our streets. I know you've had one of our own DOT, Jessica Kronstein was here. So I will give you sort of a quick slide presentation with my take on how things have been for DOT in New York City during COVID and what lessons we've learned and what we're looking forward to afterwards. All right, so watch me be technologically advanced here. Whoops. Give me one sec. Okay. All right, there we go. All right, I love this picture because this is actually, now it's getting a little cooler, but this has been the streets of New York City this summer, even at such a difficult time for our city. So I think the folks who are here from New York know these statistics, but just I know we have an international audience and a national audience, just a little bit of sense of the breadth of New York City DOT. We are one of the largest municipal transportation agencies. We have an enormous inventory, streets, sidewalks, bridges, and here in the US, we boast very big systems, the biggest speed camera system, which we're very proud of, the biggest bike network, the biggest bike share system. So a big agency with a lot going on. And just some of the statistics, again, I think New Yorkers are familiar with, but good to remind our visitors from other parts of the country and the world. Prior to the coronavirus, New York City, like a lot of big cities in the United States, was just a tremendous economic success story. Population booming, employment booming, tourism booming. we were kind of bursting at the seams. And, not surprisingly, it was starting to really have an effect on our transportation system. For many years, our subway system actually had extra capacity and was able to accommodate this big growth. But we were starting to see, even before the pandemic, starting to see a decline in subway ridership, starting to see a decline in bus ridership, which a lot of cities around the country have said. Same time, happy to say, and TA gets the credit for our partnership, seeing cycling continue to grow as a mode, also seeing ferry ridership grow in New York. Now, with all these trends, we were seeing in the central business district of Manhattan, the number of vehicles was really dropping over the years, and yet traffic speeds were continuing to drop. And I think you all know the reasons. It's true in other cities around the country. Particularly the rise of Uber, Lyft, and what we call the for-hire vehicles, as well as increasing home deliveries, which in New York is starting to be over 1 million packages a day. And this is all pre-COVID. Again, you can see some of the trends here. All right, so let's talk a little bit sort of about how COVID hit New York City. And, I think it's no secret here that we have been certainly the hardest hit city in the United States. Not necessarily in the world, but one of the hardest hit in the world. We were the first big city in New York to really feel the effects of COVID. And I appreciate you, Steve, acknowledging that, yes, we had in our city 24,000 fatalities. We had in the city workforce, both city government and the MTA, our sister agency, thousands of people ill and quarantining and 100 dying, including we lost 7 lives at DOT. So, a very challenging time emotionally for us. And then we're facing what a lot of cities are facing, challenging in terms of the revenue picture. And then adding on top of that, as we've all had, obviously, a summer and uprising after the murder of George Floyd, and demonstrations and a passionate and welcome and needed debate about racial justice, inherent racial bias, policing, issues that are of such importance to New York and to the nation. Probably a lot of you have seen some version of this chart if you're a transportation junkie. You can see obviously all those robust travel trends that I mentioned plummeting in the early weeks and months of our lockdown, and then slowly starting to see the numbers crawl back up. You can see obviously subway ridership still nowhere near where it was pre-pandemic. Bus ridership going up, but still also not where it was pre-pandemic. City bike now, and I think biking in general, frankly, now soaring above where it was pre-pandemic. And traffic really starting to crawl back, and not a welcome trend, and one I know probably a lot of the folks participating in this conference have big concerns about. Let's take a look at some of the tough news here. I know this is a Vision Zero conference, and it has been, it's been heartbreak in a lot of ways this summer. Again, talking about losses of life in our city and in the city family, but also loss of life on our roadways. We had kind of a hopeful period early in the pandemic where we went, because we were in such a lockdown, over 2 months without a pedestrian fatality, which is extraordinary in New York City. We usually, unfortunately, have about 2 to 3 a week. But as I had feared, and it's come to pass, not just in New York, but in cities all over the country, now the number of fatalities has started to really spike back up again. And interestingly enough, we're particularly seeing it with you can see here, motorcycles and motor vehicle occupants. In a lot of the cases we're seeing on our roadways, speed, not surprisingly, is a huge factor, because even though traffic is sort of creeping back, there's still times and places in the city where it is not where it was pre-pandemic. Just a little bit more on some of the details we're seeing, and obviously we're going to talk about some of the things we're doing, but we're just seeing riskier behavior behind the wheel, and there've been a lot of theories. I'm sure some in the audience, some of the experts may have their own views. People got used to speeding. The kind of people who are hitting our roadways are perhaps less risk averse. There's a sort of a frustration and an anger, and that's really translating into behavior behind the wheel. I think there's a lot of theories and a lot of study going into it, but for us, speed always remains a big factor. Just another challenge, as I alluded to, I think a lot of cities are facing it. Real questions, very good questions that we need to work through about what is the ongoing role of PD enforcement and how much can be done through automated enforcement. And I'll talk more about that in subsequent slides, but all of these are sort of some of the things we're seeing. What are we doing? And I know this is a group that is, as Steve said, will always want more from us, and we understand that. Again, for us, as I've always said, in terms of Vision Zero, the fatalities, we see the injuries. These are not just numbers to us. These are, our family, our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, our fellow New Yorkers, and we always grieve for every life lost on our roadways. Just to talk about some of the things we have done this summer, and I particularly want to mention them in the context of even when the city was in complete lockdown for a couple months, and we tried to send as many of our DOT employees home as we could to flatten the curve, we nonetheless continued the rollout of the world's largest speed camera program, because we really do think it is one of the most effective tools for saving lives on the streets. And I think very much part of the trend we all want to be a part of, which is, less discretionary enforcement by police departments and more automated enforcement. Cameras don't know what color you are behind the wheel. They just know how fast you're going. We've continued to build out our bike network. I'm going to talk more about it in subsequent slides. We had a few years back lowered the speed limit universally on New York City streets to 25 miles an hour, but there were still some arteries around the city where we had not done that. And so we found the next big group of them, there's only a handful left now, but reduced those speed limits back down by 5 miles an hour. We're doing sort of some of our traditional campaigns, reminding people daylight savings is coming. We have a new seatbelt law in New York that you have to wear seatbelts in the back seat. We're going to be doing our part to get the word out on that, and a bunch of our other campaigns. Again, this is a very hard time. I mean, I think another factor we're finding in Vision Zero, with all the stresses and things going on in people's lives, the presidential election, it's a real struggle to break through with our Vision Zero messages, but we're going to continue to do our best there. People have a lot of different things they're dealing with, and finding ways to reach them and to remind them, even as you may be worrying about coronavirus, the presidential election, your own economic situation, you still have to also think about safe behavior on our roadways. But let's sort of talk a little bit also about some of the, I think, incredible developments that we've had in New York, and I know other cities have as well. And again, I want to thank a lot of the folks who I'm sure are part of this conference for helping us do some really exciting and transformational things, which I think in the long run are going to be, not only amazing for our city, but will also make our streets safer. They will be a piece of Vision Zero. First of all is open streets. And no question for New York, this was a learning experience for us. We had a traditional model of street closures where we relied on our police department to literally man all the barricades. And, that was a safety concern. It was a counterterrorism concern. And, to the credit of the advocates and our city council, they really pushed us and said, you can't do that model anymore. We're going to have a more nimble model. We're going to have, let's encourage communities to take more ownership of of opening up streets for recreation and sort of keeping an eye on the barricades. And so that was a paradigm shift for us. It enabled us to get up to, we're up to 83 miles and counting, and to just be able to go all over the city. It really, I don't know if people realize, for New York City, other places have had an easier time doing it, no question, smaller cities, but for New York City, this has really been a big way we've changed the way we kind of operate our streets. And, it enabled us to go quickly in all different parts of the city. We started in those first very sort of difficult, dark months where where people were just worried about, could they get out for a little bit and stay social distanced? We particularly went in areas where we were near parks and where we could get things up and running quickly. But we, very quickly then turned to particularly identifying neighborhoods where, that have been heavily impacted by coronavirus, and making sure that those neighborhoods could have recreational space. Just city a little different, like an open street. Again, in a nimble model where you don't have people standing in front of the barricades all day long. We did let local traffic in. You basically had to pull up and move the barricades yourself in most cases. And we found that it worked very well. And we found a lot of traditional and non-traditional partners, business improvement districts, neighborhood associations, to help us man all these, again, to look at that map, that's a lot of different spots we did this in. And, I will say one of the criticisms is it should have been done as a more comprehensive network. Admittedly, that sort of was not where this program started in New York City. In this program, it started in the depth of the pandemic when we were city government was scrambling, people were ill, and we were just trying quickly to provide some of that open and recreational space. We certainly think, as this program continues in the future, we will think through more of those network connections. Let's turn next to open restaurants. And, I like to say as commissioner, this is a program we jumped into as quickly as anything we've ever done. And we went big. I think we went bigger than any city in the world, at least that I know of. Maybe someone in this conference will know otherwise. We essentially, New York City has a very complex regulatory and legal environment and zoning overlays. We basically had an executive order, the mayor passed, Mayor de Blasio, to override them all. We let every restaurant take the sidewalk and roadway space. And we estimated we'll get about 5,000 restaurants in the end that'll want to do this. We had 5,000 in the first week. We are now well over 10,000. This program has proved it's certainly the most popular thing that I have certainly helped oversee in my time as DOT commissioner. And again, we're proud of the fact that we listen to the restaurant industry, particularly restaurants not in the Manhattan core and other parts of the city, who said that the city's process just for sidewalk cafes is so onerous and so complicated and so expensive. We created something really nimble. You just went online and self-certified. We did discover that the one part of the program that proved the most complicated was helping restaurants understand how to be safe in the street. And that did require DOT and other city agencies standing up sort of an inspection team that had to fan out very quickly and help restaurants. I mean, look, it is marvelous to use the curb space for dining, but you have to make sure it's done safely. And I think that was probably the steepest learning curve part of this program. And the Mayor de Blasio was so enthusiastic about it, we've expanded it repeatedly throughout the summer. It was only supposed to last through Labor Day, but he announced on September 25th, this is going to be a permanent part of New York City streets. And something, again, I know many of us, including a lot of folks on this phone call, I think can really be proud of it. It's been transformational. I think on top of that, we did something which has really been my favorite part of this summer, which is combine the two programs, take our open streets and our open restaurants and say, if a group of restaurants wants to close off the street to traffic, they can do so. We started doing it just for weekend closures, but we quickly saw that there were places where you could do this all week long. And I think, when people sort of say, I wish New York could be more like Paris or Rome, this is part of, I think, getting us there, which is to really repurpose space and make it lively and make it active. And restaurants, they really do play an essential role in that. And I'll flip to this one because I happen to live right near Vanderbilt. You can't totally see it in this picture, but if you come out at night now, not only will you see the restaurants, but on that median there, and there are parts of the median that are where you can sit, people bring their own picnics. Doesn't even necessarily mean you have to pay to go to a restaurant. Kids come and ride their bikes, people play music. It has really, between closing the street to cars, but also letting restaurants bring sort of life and color and activity to the street. It has been, I think, really transformational. And I have to say, I've gotten a lot of good feedback, often from, not the usual suspects here, just picture of what we're doing in Chinatown. So once people got a taste of transforming streets, of course, the next thing we started talking about was how we could let schools do streets. New York City, to the credit of the mayor, and it's been a long and challenging road, has been able to, do a lot of in-school learning. A lot of cities have not attempted it, but New York has. It's not been without its challenges, but part of that has been, of course, to make sure that schools could have outdoor space, particularly for recreation, in some cases for classroom space. The Department of Education, we convened an interagency group. It was DOT, it was Parks Department, Department of Ed, NYPD, Fire Department. And, we leaned first into seeing schools where they had their own outdoor space or where we could do it in parks, but where that didn't work, we've created space out on the streets. It does certainly, face some of the same challenges that we've seen with open streets, and particularly because we have children playing in the streets, we want to make sure it's safe. We want to make sure that there is staffing out there, that the barricades are secure. But we're going to be, I think, over 200 schools by the time we're done. Schools are still working out their protocols. And I think this is a program that will grow over time. It's one, again, particularly as we sort of combat COVID, this is going to be a permanent part of the landscape for New York City schools. I'm going to talk quickly just about biking and busing. Again, areas where early on in the pandemic, when, as you saw from that earlier chart, subway ridership was just plummeting, and people did start to take to bikes. And we saw certainly that bus ridership was essential, particularly for those frontline workers. So we have been building out our bike network this summer. And again, I want to compliment my DOT team. It has not been easy. We have faced a hiring freeze and budget cuts and a lot of challenges, and they have worked their hearts out. They have been really committed to the mission. And I think you can see some of our guiding goals here, particularly connecting gaps, neighborhood networks, trying to continue those spines that get you throughout, important sort of interborough connections. And I won't go through all these. Here is a list of some of our major projects. We're very proud of them. I will particularly highlight, again, continuing to focus on good interborough connections to our bridges. We have now gotten, even a few years ago, there were no crosstown protected bike lanes in Manhattan. We now have 4 pairs. And, I think it is going to be really transformational for cycling around the city. Here's just some of the statistics. Again, we are going to this summer. I know everyone probably on this call would like us to do more, but we will have over 25 miles of protected bike lanes this year. That's a record for us. And again, done in a summer where I had staff out and resource constraints. So again, thanks to the DOT team, they've done extraordinary work. We will also have another 5 miles that are temporary protected. In New York City, we still have a community board process that we have to follow. But so far, all the protected miles over time, we've been able to make them permanent. And I'm sure we will be able to do that as well. Just some pictures of some of the nice work we've done. Central Park West, which we got to do an inaugural ride of the northern portion of it a couple of weeks ago, commemorate, tragically the young woman's life who was lost there. 5th Avenue. So just, some of these beautiful bike lanes. And 61st Street, 62nd, a crucial gap that folks have been wanting to see fixed. Also, just want to take a minute on City Bike and, sort of thank our partners in Lyft, because we have had a tremendous summer. Again, even as we've dealt with coronavirus, we have continued building out our system. We are far and away the largest in North America. And if you look at this sort of the lightest blue section, that's what we've been doing this summer, getting up into northern Manhattan and for the first time the South Bronx. And finally, I think fulfilling the promise of City Bike to be a system that's going to cover all parts of New York, all neighborhoods, really bring New Yorkers of all incomes and races together. We have broken ridership records. We have worked with Lyft and other private partners to provide, free memberships for essential workers and healthcare workers. It's been just a tremendous summer for City Bike, and want to thank the DOT team, but our partners at Lyft too. They've been fantastic and true to their word, really helped us build this system out. Better buses, a topic that was in the news today. We had committed to try and build out a bunch of more miles of protected bus lanes and busways this summer. We're not going to quite get to all of them. I apologize for that, but we will get to all the ones we've committed to. I think sometime by next year. We've learned some lessons here. Some projects we were able to do so quickly and so nimbly, and we've really changed our process. Traditionally, for us, bus lanes took many, many months and a lot of community outreach. I think we've come up with some good innovations this summer, including what we're calling our community advisory boards, where we're trying to bring a very diverse set of stakeholders to the table, maybe not always just the usual suspects, have them be a very regular sounding board for us. And it's been, I think, very effective in getting some of these key projects done. But look, there's always going to be places where, putting in a bus lane on a busy commercial corridor is going to be a complicated endeavor and require a little extra time to bring all the voices and viewpoints to the table. I think we found a way to be a lot more nimble. And I hope that will continue to be an evolving template for us. And again, want to thank, I think, a lot of the advocates who've been at the table with us. And again, a lot of the not typical suspects who have really tried, in local communities, business groups, and other groups to work with us. So just to close, I want to talk a little bit about some of the lessons we've learned. And I will tell you all, for me personally, the past 7 months I've been in government a long time. They've been like no other time. And, we've had to make a lot of decisions quickly and at times really fly a little blind. And I think we got a lot of things right. There's certainly some things we didn't get right. I can tell you this, we We are, savoring the things we've done well and taking to heart the lessons learned for things we didn't do well. I hope we will never have another summer like this one, but I think we've learned a lot in the process. First of all, a crisis, as everyone says, a crisis, don't let a crisis go to waste. I think this one didn't. For us, it enabled us to do a lot of things on our streets that we never could have done in a sort of a normal political year. With the power of an executive order in an emergency, the mayor was able to free us from a lot of the restrictions, requirements, challenges to city programs. And that not only enabled us to do things quickly and nimbly, I think it particularly got at the equity question in New York City. A lot of the complexities of the way we do business, it's easier perhaps for sort of deep-pocketed neighborhoods and business establishments, harder in our outer boroughs and in neighborhoods of color. And I think this really democratized a lot of these programs. For us also, it was a real breaking down of silos. I mean, at one point, as the DOT commissioner, I was in the restaurant business. Our sanitation commissioner was in the food distribution business. A lot of us learned to do some new things and work with sister agencies that we didn't traditionally necessarily work with. And that was all to the good. I think it created a lot of new relationships, a lot of creativity. It brought some fresh synergies to the table. Look, obviously, the advocacy groups, city council, you have been, tremendous partners. And again, as I mentioned, really pushed us to look at models that were much more nimble and didn't rely so much on city personnel, particularly NYPD. But in the end, a lot of these programs did still require city personnel and resources. And I have to chuckle. Occasionally I would read an article that said, city, go away, we'll just do it all ourselves. And then literally perhaps the same entity will come back a month later and say, where's the city? You need to be out here and manning things. So that's always going to be a creative tension. But I think we have evolved the model in a powerful way that does a lot more to empower local communities to run these programs. I just want to close on this final point. We have a bunch of really, brilliant and incredibly effective advocates I know in this audience, TA being at the top of the list. For me, one of the lessons of open restaurants, people who are, perhaps not big fans of buses and bikes and want to save their parking spaces, sort of, have a more traditional view of city streets. And I think a lot of those sort of things that transportation advocates traditionally push for, perhaps, they don't really resonate with some of these folks. I just found with the restaurants, it was a whole new constituency, because not every New Yorker rides the bus, maybe not every New Yorker rides a bike, but every New Yorker likes to eat out at a good restaurant. And it was just heartening for me to see. I think open restaurants brought us a whole new set of allies. It broadened the tent. And, people who perhaps I have been arguing with for years over the loss of parking or whether a bike lane should go somewhere have, sort of come and said, okay, wow, we love the restaurants. We love open streets. We kind of understand the vision in a new way now. And I think for me, that's a powerful accomplishment and just a lesson I hope we'll all take to heart, which is, finding new allies and bringing new people into looking at ways we can transform our streets, make them less auto-centric, make them safer, make them sustainable, make them available to all. So I will stop with that. Thank you all for listening and happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. My name is Danny Harris. I'm Executive Director at Transportation Alternatives. I'm honored to represent the organization and also to work closely with the Commissioner and her team on so much of the incredible work that she's leading in New York City. So with that, we have a lot of questions coming in. I would ask that you continue to bring them in. Commissioner, one thing that I actually wanted to start with is a theme that's come across a number of the conversations is really about the internal mechanisms that allow agencies like yours to move faster. So both in terms of procurement, restaffing people, but, as you sort of turned into a number of these things, and I know it ranges from, reimagining bridges to streets. Can you talk a bit about some of the things that you think have been effective and you hope can be locked in to make the work move faster moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, as I said there, the power of being in a state of an emergency and the mayor and the governor's ability, to issue executive orders, it's kind of magical. prior to the, I'll use open restaurants as an example again, because it's just a good one. New York City had one of the most complicated sidewalk cafe processes you could imagine. You have to hire an architect to do plans. You had to pay $5,000. It was go through community boards. It was just this incredibly complex process. There were whole parts of the city, particularly in our outer boroughs, where the zoning overlay wouldn't allow you to do that, in the stroke of a pen in an emergency. And it was very frustrating. In the stroke of pen with an executive order, the mayor was able to waive all of that. And we essentially said to restaurants, go online and self-certify. You can be in the street and the sidewalk today. So there's that piece of it, which is extraordinary. And I think, it was interesting when I first testified about what we wanted to do on open restaurants at the city council. Some of the council members, and look, it was a good dialogue, but they said, wait, you're going to completely leave out the community boards and us? And we said, well, if you want us to go quickly and be very broad and universal, then yes. And they said, oh, I don't know. And then I think some of them came back and said, okay, it worked. So there's sort of that side of it. I think the other side, and I think, look, the council very much wants to, I think one good thing that is going to come out of this experience is the city will be taking both the administration, both the current and probably an incoming, and the city council will be taking a fresh look at, a lot of the layers of restrictions and requirements that New York City has layered on over the years, that I think we realize now we can do without quite a few of them. I think the other piece of what you're asking about, Danny, which is how can the city make its procurement, its personnel, all those other things more nimble? It's been a long, and our capital delivery process, been a long-standing sort of cause of mine. A lot of that is self-inflicted by New York City, but a lot of that is also inflicted on us by the state. And it has never been, I think, sort of as sexy and interesting a world to untangle as some other things. But I would say to the advocates and people who want to see projects and innovations delivered faster, it is an area worth focusing on. No city takes as long and spends as much, I think, to deliver some of the kinds of projects as New York. And, some of that is legal, some of that is certainly procedural too. As I said, with again, thanks to the advocates in terms of bus lanes this summer, we sort of created a new mechanism, our CABs, our community advisory boards. And they have, and you participated in some of them, and they have really, I think, taught us a lesson about how to do things faster. They've worked in a lot of places. They have not entirely worked in all cases.
Commissioner, one other thing that you mentioned that I know is top of mind for us and a number of our partners is New York and so many other communities, they do have these proven successes. So when you're looking at a 14th Street or all the success around the initial protected bike lanes or with Vision Zero, and in many cases, the challenge really is the scale. The pilot is hard to fight for, and then it's scaling up. So do you have any advice or suggestions about, when you do have that win in a community, of how you can accelerate it so it moves beyond that trench warfare, but you can accelerate that across the city?
It's a great question. And I know one that has frustrated the advocates. I mean, look, it has frustrated us too. One that I think, again, this summer, we're still, I think, processing the lessons. I mean, on the bike lanes, we certainly didn't go as fast as everyone would hope, but for us, we went pretty lightning fast. And, we did it by sort of going temporary first. Usually I think in New York City, we often like to work out every detail before we hit the ground. We are trying to evolve that model, not work out every detail and do more to hit the ground. And I'll concede, I don't think we're able to do it yet at the scale that we would all like to see. Maybe that's the challenge for the coming year, particularly, look, when you're still in a pandemic state and you're resource constrained, that also, brings a certain amount of creativity. And I think this summer, with what we were able to do, again, I think we sort of have won over some doubters. We just, as you all know, we love to fight about parking spaces in New York City. With the open restaurants program, just like overnight gave away thousands and thousands of parking spaces with nary a complaint. So I think that's maybe helped people open their eyes up to the fact you can live without them. And not only live without them, but put them to better use.
Yeah, of course. Can you talk about some of the critical partners in your success? So especially when you're looking at MTA as a transit agency and what they're facing in terms of their critical budget shortfalls. And I would also add, I know it's something that we've talked about, but car manufacturers who are producing bigger and more dangerous vehicles that can obviously travel much faster. So can you also just talk about a bit of those constraints and how some of those relationships can work in your favor or not in terms of achieving your goals?
It's a good question, and it speaks to what's potentially a little bit at stake in this election. I have to bring politics in here a little bit. With New York City, we have certainly struggled, and we have a hiring freeze and budget cuts, and it is a struggle, and we will get through it. For the MTA and the other big transit systems in the United States right now, I think things are far more existential. The plummeting revenues that they have experienced, and they are still dramatically down in terms of revenue. Obviously, I also just want to take a minute to acknowledge the tremendous toll the coronavirus took on the MTA workforce. Many people ill, too many people lost their lives. It's a psychic blow to an organization when that happens. So they have been a great partner in working on some of the bus lane work this summer. And, together, both agencies have done a lot to increase the use of bus lane cameras, both their cameras on the buses and ours in the bus lanes. And by the way, I also forgot to plug, we've transformed the way we've done transit signal priority, in part good pressure from the advocates. A brilliant set of traffic engineers at DOT have they completely rethought the process, and now we are going at a record-breaking pace. And I'm happy to say a couple of them are going to win an award next week for their amazing work. So our two agencies have done a lot of creative work together, but for the MTA, I think if they don't get some significant federal resources, we're going to see devastating service cuts. We will not be, innovating together, looking forward. We'll be scrambling to hang on to what we have. It's very existential in terms of our transportation system. The larger question of automobile manufacturers, what is the future on, I think, so many things that are both roadway safety and climate related. That is very much going to be front and center in what we see after this presidential race and who takes over the Senate. I think obviously if we have a new administration, you are going to see a tremendous burst of energy on both making, our transportation system, carbon free, as well as I think a pent up demand at the national level, which is really where you do a lot of the regulatory work on automobiles, to do some transformative things. We'll have to see. Obviously, we'll see how the election turns out. But I think in our world in transportation, both in terms of safety and in terms of climate, in addition to all the other important issues on the table in this election, those two are big ones.
Can I ask you to weigh in a bit on electric? I think there's obviously a lot of, people are betting a lot on it. And, GM just put out their $100,000 plus GM Hummer, which isn't really helping the situation, even though it does run on electric. But, I think a lot of people are betting their future on that. And just curious if you could share your perspective, especially in a density like New York.
I got to be on another panel where we were asked the question: Are you for electrification or for mode shift? And I think looking at all the work of this administration and TA, it's not an either or, but we do want mode shift. I mean, we view automobiles in our streets not only in terms of their environmental impacts, which are profound, but in terms of their safety impacts, in terms of, as we all like to talk about, how much space they just take up on our streets and what an inefficient mode of transportation they are. So I think for that reason, I never would want the panacea to be in terms of climate. Well, everyone keeps their car, but it's just an electric car. In a city like New York, we don't want everyone to keep their car, be it electric or otherwise. That said, it is, certainly, one of the tools that is going to be in how we're going to decarbonize our transportation system. We're not going to entirely, in New York City, I think we'll continue to hopefully drive down automobile ownership, but we're not going to get rid of it in the United States anytime soon. And, there's no doubt electric vehicles can certainly be an improvement in terms of the carbon footprint. An electric Hummer is a depressing thought to me. But again, I think some of this will really be hopefully driven by, if if the election goes our way, you know, a much more favorable federal climate to thinking deeply and investing in, you know, our transit systems and modal shift, et cetera.
Can I bring you back to enforcement? So I know in the past, the enforcement actually used to fall under DOT, and then it moved into NYPD. And so there have been advocates like us who've, you know, been wanting to push for enforcement to fall back under DOT, or for, you know, increased resources that would come out of NYPD to support automated enforcement and street design. So is there, I mean, do you see a future there? Is there a traction in New York City or elsewhere to try to reimagine traffic enforcement?
It's a great question. And I know in this conference today, you all have talked about it. It's an important topic that I think every city is grappling with right now. Enforcement and you know, how we handle those questions of equitable enforcement while keeping our roadways safe. I want to be careful. I think in New York, sometimes the conversation has gotten a little blurred together. When you say DOT had enforcement, let's be a little careful here. We had what's called the traffic enforcement agents. They are not armed. They do parking enforcement and direction of traffic. They should be, I think, sort of distinguished from regular patrol officers who obviously carry guns and may do traffic stops, but they're not, their bread and butter is not necessarily parking and traffic enforcement. And it is true, though, that DOT, back before the Giuliani years, did parking and traffic enforcement. And I think in a lot of ways, it was a much better fit, because for us, it is so central to our mission, safety, mobility. For NYPD, it's an important part of what the agency does, but it's not the main part of what they do. And there has been a discussion in our city council and elsewhere about potentially transferring back that traffic and parking enforcement part of NYPD. I think people often have that discussion in a little bit of a vacuum, because the first people you would want to talk to are the traffic enforcement agents, who, by the way, are majority people of color, and they like being in NYPD. They like the protection of having a uniform, because, as you know, when you're out writing parking tickets, it can sometimes be contentious. And they like knowing that they're part of NYPD and that NYPD will be sort of there to back them up if needed. That doesn't necessarily mean in the long run we couldn't make that transfer happen, but it's you know, there's a whole workforce that needs to have a seat at the table about how we would do that. And you know, I think that's sort of a longer term goal. On automated enforcement, as you know, I agree in the long run that is the future. And I am very proud that I think New York City, unless someone proves me wrong, we have the largest speed camera program in the world. And again, good partnership with TA up there and a lot of colleagues in Albany. In Albany, we had a political change last year, and it was transformational for us. It enabled us to just increase our program by an order of magnitude. And I have certainly been talking to some of our allies up there about what the next stages of automated enforcement would look like. In the long run, that is, I think, the best solution for all. It will be universal, it will be colorblind, it will enable police forces to deploy their resources where they're most needed and get them more out of the enforcement business.
Thanks, Commissioner. Let me just, we have a couple questions that have come in. One of them is, what recommendations do you have for communities that are new to Vision Zero, and what would you tell local leaders who are looking to adopt Vision Zero?
That's a big question. I'll give a couple of guiding lights, but it also probably very much depends on the city, how big you are, what your resources are, what your roadway network is like, what your modal split is. I mean, there's sort of, you know, you have to sort of start where you are. And I think a lot of the big cities now in the US have committed to Vision Zero. I think I'll say this is going to be a challenge for New York and other cities going forward. You know, to do Vision Zero well, you know, first of all, I think you need sort of a committed set of political players. In New York, we've been blessed. We had a mayor, we've had a city council, we've had elected officials up in Albany, and we've had one of the strongest, most aggressive, you know, set of advocacy players of anywhere in the country. That set of ingredients is tremendously important. And I think, you know, step one is to build some political support for what you want to do. And one of the things I have always loved about Vision Zero is it brings together a lot of different interests. parents, school principals, delivery people. There are a lot of people out there who care deeply about safe streets, but I think, helping to organize and mobilize them and have them as champions is sort of step one. Step two, I think you do need, there's a lot of good models and details and documents about different things you can do. You can do a lot of things that are very, low cost and simple to do. And then you can do some things that take real resources. To really do it well in New York, we have, over the past 7 years, we've spent over $1 billion on Vision Zero. So we have done a lot of things which didn't cost a lot of money, but we have put a lot of resources in as well. And I would say, please come draw from all of us that have been doing this work. We have had years that have been so heartening where we've seen fatalities go down. And then we've had years, and I'm afraid this is going to be one of them, that have not been so heartening, where even with extraordinary efforts and resources, we're still seeing too many deaths on our roadways. So, we're always learning and thinking about how we can do better. And again, happy to share those with any city that's interested.
So on that one, we have another question in which I may make try to jump to where you ended with, but given all the success you had with open restaurants and how quickly they were able to advance, why are safety measures for vulnerable users so difficult, and why are the laws so hard to change?
Yeah, and it's funny. I've had a version of this question asked to me many times, which is, if you could do the restaurant so quickly, why can't you do all the bus lanes so quickly? And it's a fair question, and one that I have certainly pondered. I would sort of say, it's a lesson that we can do things quicker. I mean, absolutely. A pandemic enables you to see possibilities. But I would also say, and again, it's sort of how I ended my presentation, and a thought about tent broadening, which is a lesson I think advocates would be well to think about too. Everybody loves restaurants. It just proved to be, extraordinarily popular. Someone was saying to me about, why can't it be like the bus lanes? And I was laughing. You all may remember a few years ago, I was being sued. I had 5 different lawsuits going. I was being told I was more hated than Donald Trump, which in New York City is not a nice thing to say. I had people, screaming at me, whatever. I'm not trying to personalize it. I'm just saying, ferocious, angry opposition, and not just from local communities, from elected officials, from people who sued. I'm not saying that those are things that should completely slow you down, but I think it's not quite fair to equate something which has proved shockingly universally popular with projects that can just be a lot more challenging. Not to say we don't get them done, but 14th Street, which is such an iconic project, I got sued 3 times. We had 2 restraining orders. So I think, I guess I'll put it a little bit back on the advocates. And again, it's a little bit of my tent broadening message, which is, why don't we think together more about how we can make some of the projects we're trying to do, the buses and the bike lanes, bring in more of that big tent. And maybe that means being more creative about how we bring in, sort of unlikely allies, restaurants, schools, et cetera. I mean, part of perhaps cracking the nut here is envisioning projects that bring more people in. And I think that's what we've started with these, our community advisory boards. And that, for me, moving forward, and I say this to you, Danny, and others, that's what has really gotten my wheels turning this summer. It is not lost on me that we were able to do the restaurants so quickly, go so far, but it shouldn't be lost on you that they are sort of a popular and universally beloved industry. How do we, and ditto what we did with the schools, how do we bring those sets of allies and interests together in a way that could advance everything we want to do on our streets? I'll just put that out there for something as future discussion.
Thank you. And Commissioner, maybe I'll ask if you could sort of exit on, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty about what will happen on November 3rd and after, but if you have any wisdom to share about ways that local partners can help to influence the Vision Zero agenda at the federal level.
I'm just looking at a chat. I'm sorry, I was looking at it. Someone is talking about losing a loved one on the streets. I will answer that piece of the chat. I mean, look, we'll see what happens. Hopefully we will know the answer on November 3rd. We may or we may not. I think there's no doubt, obviously, if you have a Biden-Harris administration, I think, as I've alluded to, I think on both, decarbonizing our transportation system, on making investments in transit and rail, and in, transportation safety, you will have, an administration that is going to be a lot more sympathetic and ready to work with, I think, the transportation advocacy community. We'll have to see. I would also just say we really, it will matter a lot to whether the Democrats take back the Senate, because, those of you who may remember, the end of the Obama administration, it can be very challenging, even if you have the White House, if you don't have a supportive Congress, to pass some of the things we need. I saw in the chat someone sort of, I think, taking a little offense at my notion of, looking for more allies as we try and make our roadways safer. And I want to just address that. I don't want anyone to think that I'm trying to punt from the question of making our roadways safer. We have, I think in the de Blasio administration, done more to try and make our roadways safer than any administration before. As I said, we have the most incredible team, which has gone above and beyond every year to find ways to make our streets safe. But we do also operate in a political and legal environment, which sometimes can slow us down. And I know that can be frustrating and heartbreaking. And I don't mean to say we won't continue to fight every step of the way. But I think as we're saying here, if we want to go faster, if we want to be at scale, if we want to be more transformational, this summer, just at least to me, opened my eyes to the fact that we may have more allies out there than we realize. That's all I'm trying to say. It's not to throw up our hands and say, we're not going to keep, all our efforts, but just we could be even faster, more at scale, and more effective, I think, if we can bring more of these unlikely allies to the table.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you so much for your time and your leadership and that of your team. I want to thank everybody who is on the call, and I want to thank our sponsors, Together for Safe Roads, Darrow, Geotab, Lime, Link, Postmates, Revel, Spin. I also want to thank Steve Hindy, our board chair, for his introduction today and his leadership with TA. I want to thank our partners, Families for Safe Streets, Vision Zero Network, all the panelists and attendees. And as you know, it does take a village to build these conferences, even when they are digital. So I just want to highlight our incredible team, truly doing this work under such hardship and working to make the changes. Really, TA has an incredible team, and I'm so fortunate to work with them. And I want to highlight Jocelyn Carlisle, Mark O'Connor Diacqua, Joe Cotruffo, Erwin Figueroa, M. Friedenberg, Christine Shu, Ashley Kawakami, Amy Klein, Marissa Kirk, Katie Laura, Nate Lynch, Philip Miatkowski, Julian Lynch, Jay Oberman, Alicia Pear-Dowd, Jesse Singer, Hannah Wiadowski. Thank you. Please get some sleep. And thank you all for joining us. We look forward to joining you next year, hopefully in person. And again, Commissioner, thank you so much for your time and leadership. See you next year.
I hope we are in person too.
I hope so. Thank you, everybody.